Hello. Welcome back to the Space Gulag, otherwise known as PPSW, your favorite hangout place, and today we're back with another Star Wars story. Today we'll discover what would have happened had Padme given birth to two boys, in Han and Luke. With this change, we're going to find out what could have happened had the prequels been written before the original trilogy. Before we begin this video, special thanks to our patrons, voice actors, and everyone else a part of the Pente Patrol team. If you want a chance to win in our next giveaway, watch to the end of the video and I'll tell you exactly how you can win. Our story begins in the medical bay facility off Bolas Massa. Padme Amidala, the former queen of Naboo, had just given birth to twins. These twins were completely unexpected. She anticipated only having one child. Her husband, Anakin Skywalker, and her decided on a name for both a boy and a girl. Luke being the name for the boy if they were to have one, and Leia being the name of the girl if the child happened to be a girl. If these twins were boy and girl, it would have been much easier to name. But when the second boy came out after Luke, Padme needed to come up with a name for her second child, to which she came up with the name of Han. It was her favorite choice of the contested boy names that her and Anakin placed behind Luke. Padme was barely alive and she was giving birth, and this birthing process didn't necessarily make her feel any better. Luckily though, she was most likely going to pull through. Obi-Wan and Yoda stood on the other side of the medical bay, while Han and Luke were being taken care of by the medical droids. Bail Organa walked into the corridor and stood next to the two surviving council members. He looked at them and asked on the update regarding Padme. Obi-Wan told Bail that she was most likely going to make it. Obi-Wan then asked what the situation was regarding the Republic. Bail told Obi-Wan that the Empire, as it was now called, was not looking good. It wasn't looking back either. Mon Mothma had been in contact with him about the newly crowned Emperor holding a ceremony in front of the citizens of Coruscant. Bail asked what she meant, and Mothma told him that Palpatine was going to burn all the lightsabers that were found inside the Jedi Temple before the people of not just Coruscant but the galaxy. It would be ceremonially being putting an end to the Jedi. Bail apologized to both Jedi as they both looked at Bail with emotionless expressions. Obi-Wan looked down at Yoda and suggested that they take the children and train them with Padme's permission. There was no sense in allowing the Sith to grow any stronger in the meantime. Yoda pressed his cane down to the floor harder. A wave of chills ran up his spine, thinking about facing Sidious again. It wasn't that Yoda was afraid of Sidious, it was more of the fact that he lost to Sidious and he felt like a failure. Yoda didn't want to fail the Jedi any more than he already had. Within the span of 24 hours, he lost his entire order, and he lost the most important duel of his life, while Obi-Wan was able to beat a Sith with a higher midichlorian count than anyone in the history of the galaxy. There was a lot of shame in Yoda's heart, and sure, while Obi-Wan trained Anakin, everything other than the high ground, it didn't matter. Yoda still lost to Sidious, and Obi-Wan beat Anakin. Maybe Yoda should have allowed Obi-Wan to face the Emperor with him. It doesn't mean that Anakin wouldn't have been hell-bent for revenge, but if Obi-Wan could beat him, then it would just be as easy for Yoda and Obi-Wan to beat Anakin. Obi-Wan cleared his throat in a means to try and get Yoda's attention. Yoda looked over to Obi-Wan and asked what the issue was. Obi-Wan told Yoda that he couldn't hold himself accountable for everything that happened. Everyone had a part to play in it, and it wasn't solely anyone's fault. Yoda shook his head. He was so disappointed in himself. Obi-Wan spoke again, telling Yoda that he needed to have his mind focused on the now. If he dwelled in the past, then it could ruin his future. Right now, the Jedi didn't have a future, and they needed one. So Yoda would have to stick it out so that they may attain a future for the Jedi Order. Though Yoda was learning his toughest lesson, the lesson of failure being the greatest teacher. The tragedy of the fall of the Jedi Order was that it was a failure, on part by Yoda, but not fully. It was a failure that would forever haunt Yoda. He trained everyone that died in Order 66. All of them had at the very least one class with Master Yoda, had been a student of him. Obi-Wan looked at Yoda and then looked up to Bail. He knew that Yoda was struggling. He assumed it would be better if he took the lead on this. Obi-Wan didn't want to overstep his boundaries with Master Yoda, but it was obvious that Master Yoda needed help and some guidance. Obi-Wan stepped out of the room to check in on the two children, which were being cared for by medical droids still. Obi-Wan rubbed his beard for a moment. He thought about everything. Luke and Han would be the next generation of Jedi, but the question is, would their mother allow them to be trained? Obi-Wan didn't want to overstep his boundaries. After all, Padmé was his friend, and she had been his friend for some time. But Obi-Wan also knew how dire the state of the galaxy was. He knew that if he didn't act, the Jedi didn't act, then who would save the people of the galaxy? The Sith had too much power at this moment, and with the Grand Army of the Republic under the control of the Sith Lord himself, what more evil could be done? Obi-Wan didn't want to find that out. He didn't want anyone to find out what would happen if Sidious were to gain any more power, more than he already had as the Emperor of the Galaxy. There wasn't much more power that he could attain, but with more years under that power, what harm could it do? Obi-Wan sat there quietly, the sound of medical machines buzzing, medical droids talking, and the sounds of beeping from Padmé's heart monitor. Everything felt numb. It wasn't long before that Obi-Wan had just killed his best friend. At least, that's as far as he knew. Obi-Wan saw Anakin burning alive at the bottom of a lava bank. He assumed that Anakin would be dead from that encounter. Little did Obi-Wan know that a monster was created by him by allowing Anakin to burn alive on Mustafar. Obi-Wan wondered what other Jedi could be out across the stars. How many other Jedi were left? He looked over to see Bail Organa walking towards him. He could see the sudden expression on his friend's face. He asked Bail what was the matter. Bail told Obi-Wan that it seemed as if Yoda gave up everything. It seemed as if the Grand Master of the Jedi Order no longer wanted to play the game. It seemed as if Yoda was no longer going to try and serve his cause. His heart was too badly hurt. Obi-Wan told Bail that he wanted to train these children. He wanted to do it right, and do right by his former friend, Anakin. He wouldn't do it without Padmé's approval, and while yes, he was concerned about Yoda, this was more prescient in Obi-Wan's mind. Bail told Obi-Wan that Padmé would most likely agree to him training the twins. Obi-Wan knew, to an extent, that he was right, but part of him didn't believe it. Part of him believed that Padmé would blame him for what happened to Anakin, even though Padmé looked into Anakin's eyes and realized that the good man that she once knew was no longer there. For Obi-Wan, that was the hardest part of everything at the moment. Sure, he lost the Jedi Order. Sure, the Grand Master of the Order seemed to be giving up hope. Sure, the Republic was no longer a republic. But nothing was more agonizing to Obi-Wan than what he had to do to his former apprentice. The screams of agony still reigned in his mind. Obi-Wan couldn't escape hearing the words "I hate you" ring out over and over again. Obi-Wan stared blankly at his reflection in the medical bay window. In the background, there was Han and Luke. Surely there was something that Obi-Wan could do. Something that wouldn't take 19 years to train. There had to be another Jedi out there. Other Jedi Masters or Knights or anything. Anyone that could help him defeat the Sith. It was gallant of Obi-Wan to think that he and himself could just take Sidious on. But even he knew that he needed more time. Needed more Jedi to help him. Though Obi-Wan did not know about Darth Vader rising into the metallic beast that he was now. While Vader was convinced that Padmé died by his own hands, it turns out to be another Sith trick. Vader's new master told him that he killed Padmé on Mustafar, leaving her to die all alone. This enraged Vader. He threw Palpatine a bit, and that was a tragic mistake, because it was at that moment Vader realized he had just become a slave to the Sith. Anakin spent his entire life trying to get away from slavery, to get away from anything that would hold him down and keep him restrained like an animal. But now, more than ever, he was just a slave, again. There was no escaping this, and while Vader would have to toil with himself for a long while, he was now beset to a path of darkness. Back on Polos Massa, Obi-Wan greeted Padmé with open arms. The two long-term friends embraced each other in a big hug. Padmé in her heart knew that they were still good in Anakin, but she did also know that Anakin was dead. That's all she knew at the moment. And while the thought of her husband being killed on Mustafar was rather tragic, she came to terms with it really well. Well, of course she was upset about it, but there was no way that she could stop what had happened. She was dealing with it as best as she could. She looked at the bright side of things, which was the fact that she had two beautiful children, and she was fortunate enough to have a friend like Obi-Wan by her side. While Padmé hadn't fully decided if she wanted the children to be trained or not, she did know she was ready to go back to Naboo to raise her children. Though Padmé didn't know one other thing. She didn't know she was ready to go back into the political atmosphere. While she herself was a well-spoken politician and even a martyr of sorts, she knew that in an empire she wouldn't have a voice. Sure, the senators could talk in session, but it didn't mean that they could go anywhere with their voice of theirs. Because with an emperor, there was no individuality. There was no separate thoughts, there was only one, and it came from the emperor himself. Padmé decided that she wanted to lay low for a little bit, let the fall of the Republic pass over, so that she may return when the time was right, though she knew that her people needed her, especially since the emperor was from her planet. Padmé believed in standing up for the right cause, but she had a new responsibility, a responsibility to her children. And while it was obvious that Obi-Wan would be a part of their lives, Padmé also wasn't sure if she wanted them to be trained into becoming Jedi. It wasn't because of what happened to Anakin, it was more so a fear that she would lose her children. That's something she didn't want to lose. There's a lot going through Padmé's mind at the moment. There's a lot of things that was going through anyone's mind at this given moment. Everyone that was here on Polis Massa was experiencing the same feeling of fatigue and confusion. They didn't know what would come next. The clones were already searching for Jedi and killing them on sight. What would happen to those that were friends with the Jedi? Well, yes, Bail Organa was allowed to go to a session of Congress. He didn't know if he would be targeted for being friends with the Jedi in the past. This same fear went for Padmé. As well, she was very close with the Jedi before the execution of Order 66. Within a matter of hours, the group would depart from Polis Massa, and they would head back to the planet of Naboo. Padmé had the intention of raising her children in the valleys and mountains and the countryside. It would be a safe place from the rising empire, though Padmé wanted the two Jedi to accompany her. They were very important in her plans for raising her children. Without Anakin, she needed close friends to be there for her, and even a father figure. Obi-Wan was clearly that friend and father figure, and hopefully Yoda would help him with that. Padmé needed to do her own version of damage control. Once she got to Naboo, she would immediately reach out to the Queen and request to see her in person. Padmé, just after giving birth, was extremely eager to get back to the galaxy. The state of the galaxy was concerning to her, and she wanted to take care of the children. She was also a public servant above all. Once the group was dropped off at her private residence, Padmé left Obi-Wan and Yoda behind and left for the Theed Palace. Once Padmé arrived inside the palace, she found the Queen and talked to her about what the Emperor had done in relation to the people of Naboo. The Queen told her that he had set up another race for senator. The people of the planet were preparing to memorialize Padmé. The Emperor was under the belief that she had died, and for whichever reason, he was ready to have a funeral for her, to bury her and bury the hatchet in her, as it was. The Queen of Naboo expressed her discomfort with Palpatine's desire to get rid of Padmé and move on. Padmé saw this as egregious behavior from the supposed Emperor of the galaxy. The Queen expressed that the Emperor had been taking a hold of the galaxy with an iron fist. With the Jedi gone, there was no one that could stop him. Palpatine, other than his meeting before the Senate that was broadcasted across the entire galaxy and his ceremonial burning of lightsabers, had been exceedingly quiet. The Republic was ripped apart and the genuinely transparent leader became silent. Padmé saw that there were several issues with this, though the question was if the Republic could be redeemed. On Coruscant, the mechanical beast known as Vader was born. He was told that Padmé died when she really hadn't. Vader was also put into his place by Palpatine. The Sith Lord ensured that Vader was placed into a role of servitude. Sidious was very distraught by Vader's failure on Mustafar, because Vader should have been more capable than not losing to Kenobi. His failure to kill Kenobi was unfathomable. Sidious would make Vader suffer more than anything he would have had Vader beat Kenobi. Regardless, Sidious had other plans. First, he was sending Tarkin to Kamino to put an end to the cloning program. Tarkin would then be taking care of the entire Imperial military for the time being. It seemed as if Tarkin's loyalty to Palpatine paid off, and he was being rewarded for it. Sidious was going to militarize every ounce of the former Republic so that he could install a legacy of his own power. Sidious was also going to limit the Senate as much as he could. While he knew he couldn't just kill senators that opposed him, he did need to silence those who spoke out against him. Luckily, the people of Naboo, other than the Queen, were convinced that Padmé was dead. It made her an easy target, but as of right now, Palpatine wasn't sure if she was alive or not. The Queen of the Naboo wasn't necessarily on Sidious's side. She knew that Padmé miraculously returned from the dead, and would be turning the people against Palpatine, though it also meant that there would be a target on Padmé's back if she did. The Queen didn't want that for Padmé, so she suggested that Padmé didn't make a public appearance. But Padmé, being herself, wouldn't stand quietly. She was going to make a point to the people of Naboo that this new emperor, while having been from Naboo, didn't have their intentions in mind. Palpatine only cared about himself and establishing his everlasting rule. This would not stand for Padmé. She wanted to make sure that Palpatine paid for what he had done to the people of the galaxy, especially the Jedi. At the very least, it could be seen as a personal vendetta. After all, it was Palpatine who turned her husband into a monster. There was also another small issue. Palpatine was exceedingly popular within the Senate. He was very pro-war, and he just ended the war and the Jedi in one swift strike. Most of the people in the Senate disliked the Jedi, and believed that the war continued because of the Jedi. The fact that the Jedi fought as generals of the war, and one of their own of the Separatists led the opposition, it was just too easy to classify them as the villains. While the Senate fell for it overwhelmingly, there were still good members of the Senate that sided with the Jedi, though most of these members were not popular inside of the Senate, and most of their constituents believed that they were traitors. In short, their opinion on the state of the Republic wasn't popular. After Sidious's attempted coup on his life, the populace sided with Sidious. The story was perfectly framed so that the Jedi looked like the monsters trying to kill an innocent man. Padmé told the Queen to prepare a message for the people of Naboo, and broadcast it across the Mid-Rim. Naboo's frequencies would be able to reach the Naboo, the Gungans, and people from the closest star systems. It just meant that Padmé would have to go into hiding after sending the message. Padmé would record a message telling the people that no matter what, they were told that she hadn't died. She lived, and she was still alive despite the Emperor's wishes to have her dead. Padmé's message continued telling them that while they had been lied to by the Emperor, there was a greater truth that was being hidden from them. If the people worked together, then they could restore democracy and stop the Emperor from ruling the galaxy with his autocracy. Padmé's message ended, and she thanked the Queen before departing from the Theed Palace back to her small estate on the side of the countryside. When she got back, she found the two Jedi with her children. Obi-Wan was meditating, and so was Yoda, next to him. Luke and Han were sleeping quietly without a bother. Obi-Wan opened his eyes and looked at Padmé. She nodded at him as gently, and she stepped around the two Jedi and looked at her two children. They were both sleeping, and they were both okay. Padmé then turned around and gently walked out of the room as she stood on the patio where Anakin once stood before the Battle of Geonosis. Obi-Wan quietly got up and walked over towards where Padmé was. He told her that he was truly sorry for everything that had happened. Padmé turned around and looked at her friend as she told Obi-Wan that he did not need to apologize. Anakin was not who he was when she last saw him. Padmé told Obi-Wan that in that moment she realized Anakin was gone. While there was still light in him, if he was no longer alive, then there was no reason to be concerned about it. Padmé wasn't harsh about losing her husband, but she was more concerned about what could be changed in the present. The past was over, and she knew that. What was more important to Padmé was building a future for Han and Luke that they would eventually inherit. The two children were going to come into a world that had an emperor, not a democracy. Padmé didn't want that for them, and she knew that Anakin, the one that she fell in love with, wouldn't have wanted it either. Obi-Wan asked her what her next move was, and Padmé explained that she just sent a message out to star systems close to them and across Naboo. Obi-Wan nearly jumped out of his skin when she said this. It could be detrimental to everyone. Padmé looked over her shoulder as Obi-Wan expressed that if the Emperor believed she was dead, then, in the first place, he would have sent the clones to Naboo to finish her off. If he wanted her dead, or to appear dead to the public, then he would have ensured she was killed so that his plans didn't go uninterrupted. Padmé thought for a moment. She realized that she may have accidentally given up her position. Padmé's family estate wasn't exactly a secret to someone like Palpatine. It could be a matter of hours or days before the clones descended on her residence, ready to not just kill her, but Han and Luke and the two Jedi that were with her. Luckily, it would take more than a couple of clones to just kill Obi-Wan Kenobi and Master Yoda. Padmé panicked as Obi-Wan rubbed his beard. He realized that they would need to relocate immediately. Obi-Wan thought that Dantooine would be a nice place to hide away for the time being. Padmé agreed as she rushed back inside. She would take the children to Dantooine. Yoda stood up from his meditation as he told Padmé that they would meet her on Dantooine. Padmé was very confused, but Yoda told Padmé and Obi-Wan that he and Kenobi would be going to end the Sith Lord. Obi-Wan told Yoda that it wasn't the right moment to take him on. They needed more time. It wouldn't be right to just abandon Padmé, Han, and Luke in this moment. Yoda told Obi-Wan that Sidious was weak, the Empire was weak, it was their moment to take the fight back to the Sith and stop them from expanding their rule across the galaxy. If the Jedi could kill Sidious, they could at the very least give the galaxy the opportunity to recover and reform itself without the Clone Wars and without the Sith. Obi-Wan looked at Padmé, and she gestured that Obi-Wan and Yoda go. She would be fine until they returned. Obi-Wan bowed to Padmé as he and Yoda departed the residence. Padmé would take Han and Luke across the Mid-Rim to Dantooine, while Obi-Wan and Yoda would voyage to Coruscant to face down Sidious. Obi-Wan thought that this was a poor decision. It reflected the decision that Mace made before charging into combat with Sidious before Order 66. It was brash, rushed, and vengeful, and certainly not the Jedi way. Obi-Wan tried to communicate this with Yoda, but the Jedi Grand Master could not be deterred. He believed it was the right decision, and he wanted to give the Sith a chance to continue expanding their evil rule across the galaxy. Yoda was focused at the moment, but Obi-Wan, while having been able to best Skywalker, knew this was the wrong move. Pushing for revenge against the Sith would only allow the Jedi to fall into darkness. Hours would pass for Obi-Wan and Yoda. When they arrived on Coruscant, they saw drastic change throughout the streets. Signs were littered everywhere with hollow images of Sidious, the newly crowned Emperor of the galaxy. In the streets, there were signs with Jedi Council members on them. Their images covered these streets. These were the most wanted Jedi in the galaxy, and yet there were some that were unaccounted for. Obi-Wan, Yoda, and Shaak Ti being among them. The Coruscant Guard was almost robotic, and the Clone Trooper bar was empty, dead as if the clones hadn't been there in years. The city was unrecognizable to anything that they were accustomed to. The citizens didn't act normal either. They were rather static. The change that had consumed their planet and the galaxy was very stressful. While the citizens of the galaxy didn't like the Jedi, and bought the story that Palpatine told them about his attempted life, they thought that the mass execution of every Jedi was a bit too far. It was merciless and too much of the way like the Separatists would have handled things. While wartime was full of propaganda, the behavior the Republic showed the Jedi was very similar to what the public was told about the Separatists. Obi-Wan and Yoda were able to gain transport across the city and make their way to the Senate building through a series of unconventional methods. Meanwhile, back on Dantooine, a ship came out of hyperspace in orbit. It was a Venator-class Star Destroyer. The Queen of Naboo sold out Padmé so that she could continue to live. While the Queen liked Padmé a lot, she wasn't going to risk her life for her. There was too much going on in the current state of the galaxy, and too much polarization that kept the populace in fear that the Queen decided to side with the stronger power. When Sidious demanded to know the location of Amidala, the Queen gave her up. The clones were able to track Padmé's ship to Dantooine. Sidious gave the clones specific orders to execute Padmé and take the child back to him on Korriban. In the meantime, Obi-Wan and Yoda snuck around into the Senate building. It was empty, the halls were dimly lit, and the senators were clearly not present. Obi-Wan and Yoda realized that the Senate was dismissed for the time being, given a holiday of sorts. More or less, it was Palpatine dismissing them so that he could have free reign to do whatever it was that he wanted to do without any worry of pushback, or having to worry about the Senate fighting him on his decisions. Obi-Wan and Yoda continued throughout the halls looking for any sign of the Emperor, but it was evident that he wasn't there. Obi-Wan suggested that the two of them look inside of the medical facility, especially because Palpatine's injuries made it so that he would be looking to see if his face could be healed. So Obi-Wan and Yoda took themselves across the way to the Grand Republic Medical Facility, which now belonged to the Empire. When they entered the facility, it was full of upper-class citizens, as per usual, but there was also a presence that was all too familiar. Obi-Wan and Yoda followed the presence to the top of the building, to where they entered a private medical room. Inside of that medical room, there was a Bacta tank. Obi-Wan looked at the Bacta tank as Yoda stood back. There was a sense of urgency that filled Obi-Wan's heart. Yoda looked at Kenobi as the glass on the back cleared. It was a man. Obi-Wan's heart sank into the floor, as Yoda realized his suspicions were true. Obi-Wan looked at the glass for the eyes of the man to open as Anakin looked at Obi-Wan with anger and confusion. Anakin's initial reaction was to believe that Sidious had been killed by the two Jedi Masters. Fear then consumed him and overrode his mind. Yoda ignited his lightsaber and whipped it across the room at the Bacta tank. Anakin couldn't react as the glass shattered open and the wires feeding Anakin air and holding him up ripped apart. Anakin toppled out of the glass and landed down, cutting his body open and leaving open wounds everywhere. He coughed up Bacta as he looked back and forth, unable to do anything. He was defenseless. While his limbs were still very toned and strong, he was fragile. Anakin bobbled his head back as he ached in pain, searching for any air. Yoda watched Anakin wither away on the floor as he sheathed his lightsaber and placed it back on his belt. Obi-Wan ran over to Anakin's aid. It was his natural reaction. Obi-Wan wanted to help Anakin, but it was no use. He was suffocated, and other than a husk of a metallic suit in the corner of the room, there was no one and nothing that could help Anakin now. Obi-Wan grabbed a hold of Anakin, who lay bleeding in a pool of Bacta, and told him that it would be okay. Anakin looked up at Obi-Wan, seeing that his master truly cared about him. Anakin had undergone a lot of thinking since becoming Darth Vader. He thought about what his life would have been like if he hadn't gone to save the Chancellor. There was a lot of regret and even more anguish for Anakin. But for now, right now, in this moment, in Obi-Wan's arms, defenseless, choking on air, he looked at Obi-Wan and realized his time had come. Obi-Wan didn't want Anakin to die this way, as he held on to his fallen student. Anakin tried to speak, but he was still too weak to speak without the suit. He was lacking so much ability to do anything without the suit. While it certainly would have taken him years to recover from any of the burns, wounds, or damage done to him on Mustafar, with only a couple days after Mustafar, he wouldn't be able to do anything. Obi-Wan apologized profusely to Anakin. He told Anakin that while he would never be able to see them, Padmé bore two beautiful children. Anakin's eyes rolled over as he looked at Obi-Wan with tears in his eyes. Obi-Wan told Anakin that they would take care of them for him. Yoda told Obi-Wan that it was time to let Anakin go. Obi-Wan then turned his head around. Obi-Wan felt that Yoda had gone too far. He was losing his touch with reality, and Obi-Wan was starting to see all the faults of the Jedi unfold before his eyes. It's not that Anakin, what he did was right, but why Anakin acted as such made much more sense to Obi-Wan now. Yoda was careless, as Windu was in the final hours of the Clone Wars. How could both the Master of the Order and the Grand Master be so incapable of seeing what they were doing to their own order? Yoda was risking everything by leaving Padmé undefended to chase down revenge on Palpatine. Yoda clearly needed to take a breather. He wasn't in the right mindset. Maybe it was Obi-Wan's fault for suggesting they take care of the children, but how was Kenobi going to know that Yoda would act so unlike himself? This vengeful behavior, it wasn't full of compassion or even remotely close to the Jedi Code. Obi-Wan looked at Yoda as he tried to fathom the words to say, as he felt Anakin breathe his last breath in his arms. Obi-Wan looked down and saw Anakin's eyes fixated on him. They were no longer yellow, they were blue. Padmé was in fact right, there was still good in him. It just had to be found. Obi-Wan closed his former friend's eyes as he asked Yoda what had gotten into him. Yoda looked at Obi-Wan with confusion as he said that he was righting the wrongs of the past. Obi-Wan spoke up for the first time ever to Master Yoda, telling him that to right the wrongs of the past didn't mean destroying everything the Jedi stood for. Vengeance, searching for an enemy to exact revenge would not help the Jedi succeed, it would only cement their downfall. Sure, Vader was evil, and sure, he should have died for what he did, but Yoda killed an unarmed opponent. He killed Anakin the same way Mace almost killed Sidious. Sure, they were both evil and they both did atrocities, but the Jedi Code forbade anyone from killing an unarmed opponent. While Kenobi didn't know what had happened to Windu, the similarities were shocking to say the least. Obi-Wan stood up and told Yoda that he would be going back to raise the children of his fallen friend, rather than chasing ghosts. Yes, the Jedi needed to be rebuilt, and yes, the Jedi needed redemption, but right now, these two children were the future. If Yoda and Obi-Wan threw their lives away for nothing, then what would become of Han and Luke? Would they be trained, or would they, like their father, fall into darkness? Obi-Wan stood up and walked out of the room as he decided he was going to head back to Dantooine to help Padmé raise her children. Though on Dantooine, 2 LAATs arrived down near the personal shuttle of Padmé Amidala. The clones would empty out of their shuttles as they stayed and stormed into the ship. Clones on the outskirts ran to overlook whichever area they could. From the group, basic-looking clones, came 4 dark troopers. One of them carried a sniper rifle as he demanded the troops spread out. This particular trooper walked over towards the ledge and set up his rifle and scoped out the area. Down below, he saw a woman running with 2 children. Crosshair lined up the shot as the echo pierced the valley. The woman dropped to the floor as the children sprawled out across the ground. Crosshairs ordered the men to get down there and recover the children. The dark troopers walked up behind and asked what they were going to do next. Crosshairs removed his helmet and looked around at them as he told them that they would be following orders, delivering the children to their emperor. Inside of the shuttle, blaster fire was heard as Crosshairs placed his helmet back on and ran inside expecting to see the Jedi. When Crosshairs turned the corner, he saw 2 droids destroyed in the cockpit. The clones turned around and saluted to the commanding officer before evacuating the bridge. The clones killed R2-D2 and C-3PO. They weren't giving up the information the clones wanted, and so they were executed for not doing so. Crosshairs turned around and walked out of the shuttle as he heard a commotion. Down where Padmé was shot, she was still alive, using her pistol to shoot the clones that came near her or her children. The clones that were down there raised their blasters and filled Padmé with blaster bolts. The clones are ruthless, especially ever since Order 66 was given. The clones lowered their blasters after ensuring that Padmé was dead. The clones then picked up the 2 children as they carried them back up to their leader. Crosshair told them that it was time for them to collectively leave and return to Korriban, where their emperor requested they deliver the children. As the hours passed, Obi-Wan and Yoda would arrive on Dantooine to see the wreckage of Padmé's ship. The 2 would also find the dead body of Padmé Amidala. It seemed as if she was betrayed and the clones killed her. Though there was one issue: the clones were gone and the children had been taken. It wasn't hard for Obi-Wan or Yoda to assume it was the clones, based on their precision accuracy. Obi-Wan and Yoda were now at a loss. They lost both children of Skywalker and they had no trail to follow. Their future was now gone because of Yoda's inability to let go of the past. His focus on righting the wrongs of yesterday brought him more failure than success. Obi-Wan was enraged at Yoda, but he didn't verbally outburst. Obi-Wan was, after all, a better Jedi than he gave himself credit for. Qui-Gon knew that Obi-Wan would become a great Jedi, but Obi-Wan was just realizing how much trial and error he'd have to endure as a Jedi Master. It was brutal, painful, and even treacherous. On Korriban, Sidious was given the children of Skywalker, all a part of his plan. Once he learned of Amidala's message to the people of the Mid-Rim, he and his small talk with the Queen of Naboo, he knew the Jedi would come for him, which is why he abandoned Vader. These children would bring more use to him than the worthless husk of Anakin Skywalker. So, with the dead Padmé and Vader dead, Sidious could train himself the pupils he always wanted. Though when the clones brought him twins, he almost fell off his throne. The twins of Skywalker could be more powerful than their own father. It was remarkable to believe that these 2 beings could become more than their father. Sidious was enthralled by the children, so he took the 2 into the Sith Temple after dismissing the clones. Han and Luke would be cared for by him, and they would be trained by him. Sidious had himself a plan to create the most powerful duo the Force had ever seen. He was going to take Han and Luke back to Coruscant in due time, but for now, he would take them deeper into the Sith Temple. Sidious learned of an old Sith spell that would help him with training the twins. Luke and Han would become corrupted by the dark side of the Force, and then they would be raised into the perfect representation of evil. Sidious's plans were coming to fruition, as he found himself a tomb to place the children on. Sidious then looked over to a nearby altar where he would begin his evil spell. Sidious would enact a power of the ancient Sith used on all of his youngest members. It would make their members extremely loyal to their Sith master, no matter what. It was the same spell Sidious used on Maul decades before. The spell could only be broken by a traumatic event, which for Maul was losing his legs on Naboo and surviving his fall into a bottomless pit. But for Han and Luke, the chances of them having an experience similar to this was very, very unlikely. Sidious would train these boys unlike anything he'd ever done before. Luke and Han wouldn't have to worry about facing a traumatic event. They would have to worry about the lack of Jedi for them to execute once they had fully fleshed themselves into warriors of the Sith. The spell was quite simple, and within moments both Luke and Han were under it. They were completely subservient to their master, which Sidious was now. He would take the children back to Coruscant, where his lair was situated. On the way from Korriban to Coruscant, Sidious would request that a separate room be prepared for the twins, so they may have a place to rest and be taken care of, while he was ruling the galaxy. The operation for Sidious would be successful for months, with the Jedi being spread out across the galaxy, hunted down by clones that they used to serve with. Sidious grew in his own power. Sure, Anakin was left for dead on the floor of the medical building for weeks, but the stench was really the only issue with it. As for Luke and Han, they were doing perfectly fine. They were growing naturally, and Sidious was focusing harder and harder. And Sidious was practicing and focusing harder than ever on his readiness to train the two boys. The two Jedi had lost their trail, and after they searched everywhere for the boys, they couldn't find them. Obi-Wan then split off from Yoda, believing that Master Yoda abandoned the Jedi Code for his own personal revenge, and it costed the Order its future. Obi-Wan felt like he had failed everyone, not just the Order itself, but Anakin, Padmé, and their children. Those children would be turned into monsters, and they would put the galaxy into continuous states of fear. Obi-Wan went on the search across the galaxy to find more Jedi. At the same time, Yoda would send himself into exile. His failures were notable, but they could have been made right if he had the patience to train the children and allow time to pass so that they could pinpoint the right time to strike at the Emperor. Sidious had formed himself a small group of Force users called the Inquisitorius. They were all former Jedi who betrayed the Jedi Order to serve Sidious and the Empire. The mandate of the Inquisitorius was to hunt down Jedi and kill surviving members of the Order. If they successfully did that, then they would be allowed to live. Though Sidious didn't really care much for them, nor did he really care about the rule of two. The twins as his form of apprentice, he was foregoing the way of the Sith to establish a way of the Sith loyal exclusively to him. Obi-Wan's luck in finding another Jedi would be barren. He would find himself on a small group of individuals trying to help the Jedi called the Path, but his interaction with the Jedi was very uncommon. The few he ran into wouldn't ever admit being Force sensitive, let alone former Jedi. Obi-Wan couldn't blame them though. They were obviously protecting themselves. Of course, having a council member serve with these people on the Path was a motivation, but for the most part, it was very scattered motivation. The people were on their heels, and the Empire was growing stronger by the day. While none of the Inquisitorius would be a match for Obi-Wan, or even Yoda, the Padawans and Knights still out across the galaxy wouldn't fare the same way. For years, the Jedi would lose more and more members to Order 66, and the Empire would continuously grow stronger. Nothing would fit Palpatine's plans more than the growth and development of Han and Luke. They showed early signs of the ability to use the Force, and the moment they did, Palpatine ensured that they would learn everything he could teach them. While Palpatine wasn't dumb enough to just give away all of his knowledge, like Plagueis was, he was smart enough to train the children. Han and Luke were only 5 years old at this point. Sidious was busy kidnapping Force-sensitive beings from all around the galaxy, and preparing to use them for experiments with Lama Su, the former chief medical officer from Kamino heading the operations. Though Han and Luke would also be introduced to twins, both of them a couple years younger, but one being Mara Jade and the other Leia Jade. Though Palpatine had his faith in the two boys, he wanted to build himself a small unit of beings trained by him, and only the most powerful would be trained by him. It was also a way for Palpatine to ensure his legacy for an elongated period of time. These children would be raised to believe that he was the head of their family. It really was a demented way of setting things up, for these children to be stuck by his hip forever. But he was also a Sith after all. Sidious would ensure that these children saw their training through the end. Though there was a pride for Sidious. He felt the death of the old decrepit Master Yoda through the Force. The old Jedi Master got old and died, from what Sidious knew. But Yoda's death was self-inflicted, a combination of being unable to live with the atrocities he helped create and the ability to right the wrongs. Yoda spent the majority of the last 5 years in denial. He was dealing with the loss of his order and the loss of the Skywalker twins, and they were the key to writing the future, and he threw it all away for nothing, but getting revenge on Skywalker alone. Obi-Wan felt the death, but he couldn't stop the focus on it. He was being an underground hero, trying to make things right where things were wrong. Obi-Wan was consistently in high-stress situations, avoiding clones and stormtroopers. The Inquisitorius were never in fear for Obi-Wan, but the Emperor was. Obi-Wan had a chance at being able to best Sidious, but he knew he couldn't alone. He needed help, and without Yoda, there was no one else on par to stand toe-to-toe with him against the Sith. While he encountered Quinlan through the path, his experience with Quinlan told him that the Jedi Master wanted to help, not die. Obi-Wan in his own way felt incapable of helping the cause. The path was extremely small, and it was consistently full of breaches, which led to the Inquisitorius getting the jump on the Force users and young Jedi, who stood no chance. Several more years would pass as Han and Luke would grow into young adults with Mara and Leia. The two sets of twins were often separated. Sidious did this so that they could build a romantic tension between the four of them. Sidious truly intended on building a legacy here, and it all started with both sets of twins. Sidious also did this separation to build a difference in fighting styles between the siblings, so that whenever Han and Leia sparred, or Mara and Luke sparred, they would each have their individual strengths and weaknesses, which they would discover with one another. Sidious also specifically separated the four into groups of duos, of which would most likely match well with one another, and it seemed to be working relatively well. As for the state of Palpatine's galaxy, the Death Star was nearing completion, and without anyone to fight it or have any chance of rebelling against it, there was no reason for Palpatine to fear the fight against his superweapon. Most of the insurgents were put out early on in the Empire's development. While the path existed, and was well known by most of the Empire to exist, it wasn't really a rebellion. It was more so a group of individuals protecting Force users. Nothing really mattered, though. At this point, Han, Luke, Mara, and Leia were ready to go out into the galaxy to do the bidding of their master. With the Death Star performing a successful bombing of Geonosis, destroying the entire planet, the Empire was near unstoppable. A group of rebels in the Lothal sector were also put down by Grand Admiral Thrawn. Sidious would send the children out into the galaxy to act like Force users and then strike down the Jedi when they found the home of the path. The children would separate into duos as they departed from Coruscant for the first time in their lives. Luke and Mara would head to Mapuzo, and Han and Leia would head to Daiyu. It would take some time, but both sets of Sith would find their way to Jabim. From Jabim, it would be a massacre. With the Sith reporting the location of an Imperial army, they would land under the leadership of General Veers, and 4 young adults, Han, Leia, Luke, and Mara. They would successfully wipe out the Jedi, and even kill the older Obi-Wan Kenobi. Their movements were remorseless, and they made the Inquisitors look obsolete. Sidious, again, didn't really care though. The Grand Inquisitor was extremely loyal, and we saw how that worked out for Tarkin. While the Jedi fared little to no chance, the rebellion would die out after Sidious disbanded the Galactic Senate. Every opposing senator was turned into a target, and the leaders of the rebellion would be snuffed out. While Palpatine continued to train his students, he would find that training them no longer did anything. They were perfectly loyal students, who were extremely powerful. Sidious was proud of them, and even deep down cared for them. At certain ages, both pairs would elope, elongating the legacy of Sidious's reign. Luke and Mara would have a couple of children of their own, and Han and Leia would do the same. Sidious thought it to be ironic that, through the creation of Skywalker, he was able to establish a legacy of the Sith, loyal to him and his ways. As Sidious approached his late life, he would learn how to transfer his essence into a younger body, and successfully become the first eternal Sith Lord. The children would continue to serve their master, and continue to leave behind more and more Sith, of which Sidious would turn into his own personal army. As for the Empire, it would see continuous growth, without fluctuations, in a galaxy ruled by the evil reign and power of the Empire. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story. Again, special thanks to Benjamin Wells, Icy Raptor, Gort for supporting the channel. Let's see if that like this so I can see whatever the next video is. I don't know yet. If you want to see a what if, let me down below. I read all your comments about no crossovers. Check out the Twitch community Discord and Patreon if you want to support me in other ways. And let's talk about how you can win. If you want to win, go down below, you subscribe. We are going for 50,000 subscribers, so subscribe so we can give away 3 lightsabers. We'll give away 3 lightsabers. Then go down below. There's a pinned comment. On the pinned comment, there's a doc. You type on the doc, you put your name there, and I will select 3 winners when we hit 50,000 subscribers. So smash that subscribe button. We are getting close. We are making our way there slowly but surely. And let's talk about our story. So this one is, I'm probably going to get comments about this, the misleading thumbnail. The person that made the thumbnail with complete creative freedom. I didn't have an idea for this story until I started writing it. Originally, it was going to be a very light-sided ending. It was going to be essentially what if, you know, Luke and Leia were trained by Obi-Wan and Yoda, which was going to be, obviously, Luke and Han being trained by Obi-Wan and Yoda. And to a certain point, I really wanted to do that route, but I got somewhere and it didn't feel natural as it felt when I first started. Obviously, there were some events that happened in the beginning of this where I was kind of like, okay, well, I don't think this is going to work as naturally without making it feel like it's forced. So, as all of you know, I don't like I don't like forcing things because it makes it feel unnatural. And yes, I think I'm going to get the biggest controversy out of Yoda's behavior. But I go to that length to kind of show the corruption of the Jedi. It's more so showing the corruption of the Jedi, not just because of what Mace does, but because of what Yoda does. It's not just, you know, Windu, but it's also the Jedi as a whole were just too corrupt for their own good, and it's kind of doing a play on that and doing that representation through Yoda's actions that are very un-Jedi-like. You know, taking his own life, being one of them, seeking revenge, taking the life of an unarmed individual. It's all very un-Jedi-like. And Obi-Wan gets to see that for the first time as he sees that Yoda isn't sticking to his mandate of the Jedi Code. He's going off on a whim. He's going off and being some macho man trying to be something he's not. And I think that's kind of what I was going for there. Is Yoda struggling with having to be something he's not, and that's not a Jedi. And I think him doing that would cause a failure of the Order. And I think that's where I decided that I wanted to have more fun with this and kind of do a dark side path. Now I know, like, we could have done, you know, Han and whatever fighting side by side and all that kind of stuff, but once I started down the dark path, I was just like, alright, let's make it darker. Alright, let's make it more dark. Well, let's keep going. And that's kind of what I went for, and that's what I kind of followed through with, is how dark I could really go with it. And obviously the whole thing between the twins, you know, kind of growing up together and kind of being forced to elope with one another is kind of freaky deaky kind of stuff that we don't like around here. That's like arranged marriages, and those are no bueno. But the entire idea is not that it's a good idea, but it's the fact that the Sith are kind of messed up, and we should see them for being messed up. Now, why do I do that? Because I'm drawing a comparison, because the Jedi are the lesser of two evils. I think that's something that we often overlook. Like, people are like, oh yeah, the Jedi are bad, but it's like, yeah, but they're not the Sith, and that's why they're good. Like, they're the lesser of two evils, and that's kind of where I was, I guess, going in the grander scheme of meanings and deeper meanings behind characters or certain people doing certain things or whatnot. It's more so the deeper understanding that, yeah, the Jedi are corrupt and they've made their mistakes, but you also have to remember the Sith are kind of effed up. They're just completely messed up, and their code of ethics is just off the charts insane. So it's kind of a play on that as well. As for Han and Luke, it's a shame that we didn't get to go into their story a little bit more. I think that's something that I regret the most, but it didn't fit naturally into the story. When I started writing it, it was more so about, you know, how it would change with Han being Luke's brother. And I really don't see much of a change happening if it goes the normal trajectory, right? If Han is raised with Bail and on Alderaan and Luke goes back to Tatooine, nothing really changes. It's probably going to be the exact same events, and I don't want to rewrite Star Wars. That's not my point. That's not what I do here. I don't rewrite the movies that you've already seen. I write something new, and that's what I always want to try and stick with. I always want to try and stick with a new experience, and that's what I tried to give here, with something that was certainly not what you expected, but something that went in a completely different direction. And yes, you could say it kind of followed along the lines of what if Padme survived, and I intend on doing one of those one day. So, you know, go ahead and hit the comments up for the algorithm, but I mean, I do intend on doing that one day. I think I have a thumbnail being made for it right now, but I didn't want to just do that. I didn't want to do that either. It gives me more freedom to do that story. But I wanted to do something that's fit uniquely to this, which was having two brothers being trained by the Sith into the most powerful beings ever and just wiping the floor with the Jedi. And yeah, so I hope you all enjoyed this. It's certainly a different story. I know it's a bit out there for the dark side stories that I normally do, but it's a great example of how I don't get what I normally plan. I planned for a light side ending in this story, and it turned out to be dark, which is how it usually goes when I have a light side ending story. It ends up starting out dark and turns really light, turns really hopeful and poetic and whatnot. So anyways, hit that subscribe button. Andor's show's coming out in a couple days. I got something planned for Andor's release, so you better smash that like button and that subscribe button. Let's hit that 50,000 subscribers, and I'll give away your 3 lightsabers. And anyways, I love you all, my friends. Spread the love, and always remember, may the Force be with you.